Welcome to the Sports Governance Podcast, the place where we dig into the systems, decisions, and power structures that shape sports all around the world. My name is Younes Filali, and in this ninth episode, we turn our attention to a rapidly unfolding geopolitical crisis and its effects across international sport. Over the past weeks, the war led by Israel and the United States in the Middle East has begun to disrupt the global sporting landscape. Major events scheduled in the Middle East are rapidly being affected. One of the clearest examples is the finalissima between Spain and Argentina, which was supposed to take place in Qatar this month, but has now been cancelled after security concerns escalated across the region following Iranian strikes in Gulf states. But beyond a single match, the situation raises deeper questions about the governance of global sports. What happens when wars intersect with a sports system that claims political neutrality? Who decides whether competitions should go ahead, be moved, or cancelled? And how consistent are international sports bodies when applying sanctions or responding to geopolitical crisis? To explore these questions, I'm joined today by Stanis Elsborg, head of Play the Game, an international initiative linked to the Danish Institute for Sports Studies that focuses on governance, ethics, and power structures in global sports. Stanis' research looks closely at the intersection between sport, politics, and international relations, making him an ideal voice to help unpack how global sport institutions navigate moments of geopolitical instability. Let's break it down. Stanis, thank you for joining me today. Through your work at Play the Game, you've spent years examining the relationship between sports, politics, and power in global sports systems. Before we dive into the current events, I'm curious on a more personal level. When you look at the way sports and geopolitics keep colliding, as we are seeing again today, what first drew you to study this intersection in the first place?
Well, I have a master's from the University of Copenhagen, where I studied sports history. And when I was about to do my master thesis, I talked to a professor at the university who had spent even more time than me and looking at the intersection on sport and politics. And that was just about when the 2014 Winter Olympics in Sochi was about to take place. So, having studied all kind of sports political matters way back in history, I thought it would be very interesting to look at Russia, who was really, well, probably the most big player in world sports in the 2010s, and they were going to host the Winter Olympics. So I started to study Russia, and especially Vladimir Putin's use of sport in a geopolitical context. And I studied the Winter Olympics and the opening ceremony and how he actually used that politically, both for the domestic audience but also the international audience. And from there on, my interest in the connection between sport, politics, human rights, and sports governance only grew. And then I was lucky that Russia was about to host the 2018 World Cup, and the media saw an interest in me, and so did Play the Game. And from there on, we have been looking into all kind of political matters in the Middle East, USA, Europe, you name it.
You talked about the Middle East. The current war in the Middle East is actually affecting sport. For example, the finalissima between Spain and Argentina that was initially supposed to be played in Doha later this month is now cancelled. Over the past decade, several Gulf states have positioned themselves as global hubs for sports events. Does the current conflict expose structural vulnerabilities in that model of sport globalization?
I think this situation really highlights how difficult it can be for global football to fully anticipate and manage all kind of geopolitical risk over time, including wars and all kind of conflicts. I mean, decisions about hosting are often made many years in advance based on a different kind of combinations, also political lobbying and so on, but also about infrastructure, partnership, strategic considerations, and so on. At that stage, of course, the broader political context may appear stable or manageable. I don't think anyone could have foreseen the war that we are experiencing between US, Israel, and Iran at the moment. But I think what we're also seeing is also a reminder that these geopolitical dynamics can change very quickly, and in ways that sports organizations, of course, have no mandate or have no possibility to control. So even very well-prepared hosts can sometimes find themselves in and be affected by developments beyond their borders, as we are also seeing now with Qatar, the UAE, who is not necessarily that close a part of the war. So I would say, rather than pointing to a failure in sports governance as such, it may also illustrate the limits of these long-term planning when we're looking at events in sports.
Well, the conflict, as we already said, already forced concrete cancellations in global sports. Apart from the Finalissima, we can also talk about the Formula One, calling off the 2026 Bahrain and Saudi Arabian Grand Prix due to security risks, raising a broader governance question. Like, from a governance perspective, who actually decides when these events are postponed, relocated, or even cancelled in such crisis?
Well, I think formally, I think the answer varies very much depending on the competition and the federation. I think one of the revealing answers in this is maybe that these decisions are rarely made by any neutral sporting authority alone. So, for an example, if we look at FIFA and their World Cup, it actually gives FIFA quite a broad discretion over matters that they would not otherwise have. So in that end, I think it would be FIFA's final decision whether or not to go forward with the tournament. In practice, I think that these decisions emerge from a mix of federations, confederations, local organizers, governments, security issues, commercial partners, broadcasters, and so on and so on. So it is really a complex issue to decide to either propose, to relocate, or in the end cancel a big sporting event. And that's also maybe why these moments that we're experiencing now are so revealing about modern sport, because sport, often presents postponements and relocations as purely technical safety decisions. But I think in the end, it's about power, liability, political risk, and also in the end, whose interest are protected first.
During the 2022 World Cup in Qatar, we saw strong activist campaigns, slogans, and even calls to boycott the tournament because of human rights concerns, rightfully. Yet today, despite an ongoing war involving one of the countries hosting the 2026 World Cup, we see very little comparable activism or boycott discourse directed at the United States. Does this reveal a form of selective moral outrage in global sports? And what does that say about how political criticism is applied in international sports?
So this is a really good question. And I think that we need to handle this point quite carefully. I mean, the
floor is yours.
Yeah. So, I mean, the starting point for me is that the criticism of Qatar in 22 was not wrong at all. On the contrary, I think much of it was necessary and actually in some cases long overdue. There were serious issues related to migrant workers, labor conditions, governments, governance and human rights that really deserved the attention. To me, it actually came all too late. And I would also add that there are still quite important issues from the World Cup in Qatar that has not either been fully told or understood. One of those cases could be the case of Abdullah Ipais, who worked as a communication manager for the Supreme Committee in Qatar, the ones who were responsible for delivering the Qatar 2022 World Cup. At our Play the Game conference in 2025, he actually gave quite an extraordinary and also chilling testimony about how Qatar were monitoring journalists, profiling journalists, and quite strategically managed to shape what we could call a flawless global image of Qatar as a state. To me, it's one of the most powerful speeches I've actually ever witnessed. Maybe also because Play the Game and myself was highly involved in covering the Qatar 2022 World Cup. He also described how some journalists were rewarded with access, others monitored, or others shut down. He said that Qatar had profiles for all journalists: who was the friendly one, who was the supportive one, who was easygoing, critical, and so on. And Qatar had a way to handle each and every one of them. And he paid a really big price for speaking out. He was arrested in 2019, imprisoned for more than 3 years, and separated from his family, all for defending honesty and human dignity, actually. So when we talk about Qatar 2022, I think it's important to remember that the debate was not only about visible issues like migrant labor or migrant workers' death, but also about information, narrative control. But when we look at the 2026 World Cup, I would actually be cautious about concluding that there is a lack of scrutiny. I think the United States and Donald Trump is arguably one of the most scrutinized in the world. And I think Trump is probably among the most heavily covered global political figures. I actually think he will be the most covered figure. The journalists that we work with, and we know from our network, I must say, and I must be very honest, they have and are critically examining the intersection of sports, politics, and the World Cup in 2026. At Play the Game, we ran a full series last year looking specifically at Trump, sport, and politics. However, I would say there is also a difference in how certain issues can translate into public mobilization. I mean, the migrant worker conditions in Qatar, including the widely reported death of migrant workers, they were quite concrete, visible, and very easy to communicate across global audiences for the media. And they created what I would say quite a clear and emotional, resonant narrative around the World Cup. I think it has been more difficult when we look at the 2026 World Cup for journalists and media. Maybe it is not so easily condensed into one single storyline, which I would say is actually also one of my criticism about the media and the World Cup in 2022, because it maybe came to be much more about the migrant workers.
But the thing is, like, for the 2026 World Cup, I'm not just talking about how the media is handling it. Because I remember in 2022 there were also federations that wanted to boycott the World Cup at that time.
That's a whole nother story, because there you are completely right. I mean, I think we should be fair to say that it was not that there were so many federations criticizing Qatar, but there were more than we are seeing about the 2026 World Cup. And to me, I would say it's quite disappointing to experience the debate about the 2026 World Cup from the sports world itself. I mean, who's even talking about it? That's very disappointing. I would say that coming from Denmark, where I live, we had quite an active federation regarding the World Cup in Qatar. They did all kind of stuff related to the World Cup.
I remember there was a black kit also during the World Cup, right?
Yeah, the famous black kit, which the federation and
it was a huge statement at that time.
It was a big statement, but I can tell you maybe details for the people not living in Denmark. Uh, the federation, the Danish Football Association, was not completely aligned with the ones who had actually made the shirts. So the statements differed a little bit, depending on who you asked about the statement. But yes, you are right. Denmark was quite vocal regarding the Qatar 2022 World Cup, but regarding the 2026 World Cup, they are not saying much. Regarding the 2030, 2034, they are not saying much. And that's a real disappointment, because in Denmark, we actually tend to say that we have quite a nuanced debate about sports political matters. And we also do have that with our National Olympic Committee and the president there. He's quite vocal on other issues like Russia and so on. But the Danish Football Associations, well, they are not saying much. And that's a disappointment, because if you are part of FIFA, you are in principle part of a democratic structure where you are obliged to say how you feel about a World Cup or a peace prize for the US president, which has been awarded by FIFA's president. So that's a real disappointment. Very, very good point, because I would say the media is one thing, but those who should actually really be criticizing or speaking out if they don't agree, well, that should be the federations.
We heard a lot of speculation lately, but for now, at this exact moment, Iran is still expected to participate in the 2026 World Cup, but is trying to avoid playing in the United States, and the situation remains highly uncertain due to ongoing geopolitical tensions. What kinds of governance challenges does that create to FIFA in terms of competition integrity, qualification rules, and even potential replacements?
I think, first of all, I must say that it has been quite difficult to follow the reporting around what's happening there regarding the World Cup. I mean, Reuters reported on March 19 that Iran soccer chief said that the team would continue World Cup preparations but would not play in the United States. While another Reuters report earlier in March said that Iran could not participate at all, according to the country's sports minister. So
yeah, there were two different statements that were made at different times.
Yeah, and I mean, so FIFA, I mean, they are dealing not only with a participant issue, but with an unstable and political evolving one. And we will not know before the World Cup starts whether or not and how it has been handled. But of course, we have to know soon, because it creates, you're asking about governance challenges, to be at least three challenges. I mean, first, the competition integrity. I mean, if a qualified team refuses to play, FIFA must decide whether this is a withdrawal, a venue problem, force majeure issue, or a political driven boycott. Second, there's the qualification rules. Well, what happens if they withdraw? Who will be the next one to take the other place? And that has to be found out quite quickly, so that team can also have the reasonable time to prepare. And third, and maybe the most important one, is the precedent one. I mean, whatever FIFA does now will shape expectations for future cases involving war, sanctions, or geopolitical issues related to participation in a World Cup. And that's maybe the deeper issue, because FIFA likes to speak as though the World Cup is a universal sporting platform that transcends politics. But I mean, if a team can qualify for a tournament and then be unable or unwilling to play because of geopolitical conflict and war connected to one of the host states, then that fiction of separation, of course, becomes completely difficult to maintain. And at that point, I mean, FIFA is no longer just stating a sporting tournament, it is actually governing what maybe we could call a geopolitical arena.
I remember also just lately seeing Trump's statements about, like, what kind of message do you send to a football national team where you tell them Actually, it's better for your safety to not come to the US. Like, it's such a strong statement.
And that's outrageous to me. I mean,
Yeah.
because that's a host nation actually saying it's not safe to play in our tournament. And then if that's real, if he really means that, well, how can FIFA justify having a tournament in a country where a participating team is not safe?
We have recently also seen members of Iran's women's football team seeking asylum in Australia during the Women's Asian Cup. Before, most withdrew their claims and returned to Iran under consistent circumstances, with only a few remaining abroad amid ongoing safety concerns. What responsibilities do international sport bodies have when athletes become politically vulnerable during geopolitical conflicts?
Well, I mean, the responsibilities are much greater than sport usually admits. I mean, as you say, I mean, it's been reported that some members of the women's team have sought asylum in Australia. They later withdrew and returned to Iran. And the broader issue for me is clear here. Athletes can and will always become politically vulnerable precisely because they are visible representatives of the nations when they participate in a tournament. And that can happen in moments of crisis or war, as we are seeing now. And in those situations, international federations cannot hide behind the word neutrality. I mean, neutrality too often becomes a way for international sports federations to avoid responsibility, while the athletes would carry the full personal risk. And the governing bodies in international sports should have safeguarding mechanisms, reporting systems, legal and welfare support, and of course a clear human rights-based protocol for how to handle issues like we are seeing now, which can involve intimidation, retaliation, asylum risk, and so on. So they have a huge, huge responsibility. And if sport claims to be athlete-centered, that commitment must mean something when athletes are no longer just competitors in a sports event, but also politically exposed human beings. Otherwise, athlete welfare and so on becomes just nice words and big slogans. So they have a huge responsibility.
FIFA recently partnered with Trump's Board of Peace to help rebuild Gaza through football, including plans for 15 mini pitches, several full-size fields, a FIFA academy, and even a 20,000-seat stadium. In a territory where basic infrastructure like housing, water, and hospitals remains inaccessible, how seriously can we take this type of sports diplomacy?
I think it should be taken very seriously. I mean, to me, FIFA's president Infantino is engaging in a very, very political issue, which I don't actually think is what the FIFA president should be doing. Because when FIFA aligns itself so openly with a heavily politicized initiative involving world leaders and state actors, the old claim that football governance is political neutral becomes impossible to sustain. And to me, this looks like quite a strategic politically closeness dressed up as development for the FIFA president. On the other hand, it's a good thing. I mean, who can be against football pitches, a FIFA academy, a stadium, and so on in Gaza? Who can be against FIFA raising millions of dollars for soccer-related projects? But I think
there are some people who are gonna tell you they need more urgent stuff like at the moment right now. Like having football pitches wouldn't be the priority.
No, and that was my point. I mean, that was exactly my point. So if FIFA really wanted to help, it probably shouldn't be football pitches. I mean, so I think it should be. I don't think in any way FIFA should have been a part of this. If FIFA wants to help people in Gaza, they can help people in Gaza, and it's not football pitches at the moment. At least I don't think so. It could be other things, but of course, I'm not against giving the people of Gaza any help of football pitches or academies or stadiums, but I mean, well, I would just ask very gently the question, who is asking for a 20,000 seat stadium in Gaza at the moment? I don't think anyone is. So it's political symbolism.
Another point that has been raised by many observers is the absence of sanctions against Israel in international sports, despite precedents where federations have been sanctioned. And during a lot of conflicts, such as Russia. This week, FIFA fined the Israel Football Association approximately $200,000 and ordered anti-discrimination measures for breaches related to racism and fair play rules without imposing any suspension, which is obviously very insufficient.
Well, the honest answer here is that these type of political sanctions in global sport are not applied through one stable principle. I mean, they have no principles and they have no criteria on how and when they want to exclude nations. So Russia's exclusions, of course, showed that international sport can act decisively in these matters. But that precedent, of course, also made future decisions very inconsistently. I mean, and much, much harder to defend, because you're right, there is a war between Israel, Palestine. There is a war between Israel, US, and Iran. But we are not seeing the same kind of exclusions in international sport. So once one war leads to a sweeping exclusions and another one doesn't, these governing bodies really have something to explain, and they usually don't want to explain it. And this is why the language of neutrality becomes so revealing. I mean, we have also seen now that the international sports organizations want to include Russia again. And because it explains the urgency that they want to speak about peace, inclusion, depoliticization, neutrality, because in the end, it's much easier for sport to have all nations included and not exclude one, because they can't find the argument, or at least they don't want to find the argument for excluding the US because they are war at Iran. They don't want to find the reasons for excluding Israel because of what's happening in Palestine. So that's a really big problem. And as I started saying, the most honest answer is that they don't have any principle or criteria. And when they excluded Russia, they started to go down that road, and that's why they are so eager to include them into world sports again. And of course, FIFA and the IOC at the top of the sports world really want Russia back as quick as possible, because then they can stop talking about excluding other nations.
You're talking about the fact that the IOC and FIFA want countries like Russia back to stop certain polemics right now, but they are not doing so. Can we say that the power is very westernized then?
Oh, actually not in FIFA and the IFC. I must say that those who really exert power in FIFA and those who Trump is a new player in sports politics. We have to recognize that. And of course, you could say he's Western, but I would say he's more acting like autocrats are in world sport as well. So I would say that for the last 10 years, FIFA has been highly, highly dependent and engaged with autocratic regimes like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, the UAE, China, and now Infantino is highly engaged with Donald Trump. So I actually don't think the exclusions have been relying on any Western moral or Western decisions. It was easier for international sport to exclude Russia because the world society, and especially Europe, decided to, on a political level, to sanction Russia. So it has been easier for the sports world to defend that decision because the other argument when we are talking about other countries is sport would say, well, there's no political sanctions, so why should we exclude them? Yeah.
I see your point. And looking at all these developments together, events disrupted, teams potentially withdrawing, and athletes caught in political crisis, does this war reveal deeper weaknesses in the governance structure of international sports today?
I think yes, and it relates to what I was just saying because it reveals that in the governance structure of sport, they have not really been ready to how to handle in modern times when there is a war outbreak in any part of the world. How should sport respond to that? They did respond though, so they did exclude Russia. And of course, that made a precedent, and that made it very difficult for organizations like FIFA, the IOC, or any other federations. How should we then handle other wars? And they have not found any solutions to that. Or, well, they have. The solution will be that Russia will be included in world sport throughout this year, and they will be fully back, I think, within this year. So yes, you could say it points to a weakness in the governance structure of international sport, or I would say it points to the lack of criteria and principles on when and how you can exclude countries.
Finally, since this is called the Sports Governance Podcast, I would like to end with a more conceptual question. Stanis, how would you define the term sports governance today?
Oh, good question. I mean, 10 years, 15 years ago, Play the Game was probably one of the first to actually start looking at the term governance. And we did our sports governance observer. Today, everyone, even the international federations, are talking about governance. It has become the key word in defending how sport organizations are handling different kind of cases. Because in principle, most of the big sports organizations have the papers in place. So the governance in terms of legal disputes, statutes, and so on are in place in most places. But the other thing is, how are you then exercising the governance in the sports organizations? And one clear example is that you know that most sports organizations, the IOC, FIFA, speaks about sports autonomy, that there should be no sport political interference in world sport. But then how can a president or a royal member sit in executive board, for an example? So that's an example that most organizations know what sports governance is. They have it on paper, but in reality, they don't care. I mean, they are not following their own governance rules or structures or statutes. So, yeah, I think that would be my answer to that.
What today's conversation makes very clear is that moments of crisis don't create governance problems in sport. They expose them. We discussed how decisions that are often presented as technical, like postponing events, relocating competitions, or allowing participation, are in reality shaped by a mix of political pressure, commercial interests, and risk management. And as Stanis highlighted, these decisions are rarely made by any single neutral authority, but rather emerge from a fragmented system of actors with competing priorities. We also explored a deeper issue, the absence of clear principles. Whether it's the inconsistency in applying sanctions, the selective nature of political criticism, or the way international federations respond to war, global sports governance still lacks stable criteria for how to act when geopolitics enters the field. Perhaps most importantly, this conversation challenges one of the most persistent ideas in sports, that it can remain neutral. But as we've seen, neutrality often becomes less a principle and more a way to avoid responsibility, while athletes and stakeholders carry the consequences. In the end, what this moment reveals is not just a crisis in world politics, but a structural limitation in how global sport is governed. The rules may exist on paper, but as we discussed, how they're applied in practice remains deeply inconsistent. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to help shape the next ones, let me know what topics you would like explored. If you found this useful, make sure to follow the podcast on streaming platforms and LinkedIn. You were listening to the Sports Governance Podcast by Jons Fideli. Thank you for tuning in. Until next time.